The Middle East is at war. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States initiated a large-scale attack on Iran. Their goal? To bring Iran to its knees and force it to accept their demands, which are, well, I'm not entirely sure. Sometimes it's unconditional surrender, sometimes it's a not clearly defined change in government. Whatever the case, an end to Iran's nuclear program and severe limitations on its missile and defense capabilities are probably among the core demands. And in the first days of this war, it looked like the US and Israel might manage to pull it off fairly quickly. They eliminated much of the Iranian leadership, including Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, established control over much of the country's airspace, and destroyed much of Iran's military capabilities, most notably their navy. But despite these early successes, Iran has shown by now that it has two strong trump cards of its own up its sleeves, which are at the core of its war strategy and could shift the course of the war in its favor. The first one is Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which around 20% of global seaborne liquid petroleum shipments pass. And even though Iran's navy has been largely destroyed by the US, Iran's ballistic missiles, Shahed drones and sea mines continue to pose a serious threat to ships in the region, and so shipping has basically come to a halt. This caused energy prices to rise significantly, putting immense pressure on the global economy. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz hits Iran's Arab neighbors especially hard, as they not only rely on it to export their oil and gas, but also to import vital commodities like food. As a result, they now have to use alternative routes, which take longer, cost more, and have far less capacity. Now the US is trying to mitigate these effects, but it's difficult to find a good solution. Pausing sanctions on some oil and gas producing countries like Russia is an idea, but this would empower a rival. Another one is to keep the Strait of Hormuz open by force, but that would be extremely difficult to achieve and would probably require a ground force securing the Iranian side of the Gulf to prevent the launch of missiles and airborne and underwater drones, which would be extremely risky. Recently, the Trump administration ordered around 2,500 additional Marines to deploy to the region and also attacked military installations on the Iranian island of Karg, where most of Iran's oil is being shipped from, which indicates that seizing the Iranian side of the Strait of Hormuz, or at least Karg Island, is a consideration. And the second trump card is Iran's ability to launch massive, cheap missile and drone attacks across the Middle East. So far, Iran has fired at various targets in many of its neighbors, not only targeting Israel and US bases in the region, but also other targets including hotels, airports, oil refineries, and even desalination plants. Now, the scope of Iran's attacks against its neighbors surprised many analysts, because most of Iran's neighbors have been outspoken about their desire to keep the region peaceful and had even tried to convince the US to reach an agreement with Iran shortly before the war. So you might be wondering, why did Iran attack them anyway? The relationships between Iran and its neighbors, especially the Arab ones, are complicated. They are plagued by historic rivalries, territorial disputes, religious differences, and a competition for influence across the Middle East, which has expressed itself in several conflicts like those in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. However, its neighbors still saw Iran as a counterbalance to Israel, which seeks to dominate the region in its own way, and they were also aware that the war between Iran, the US, and Israel would be catastrophic for the entire region, and this possibility was hanging like the sword of Damocles above them. And should that sword come down, it would cause serious damage to their economies, potentially even threatening the stability of their governments. Let's take a look at the United Arab Emirates, for example. Since the start of the conflict, Iran has attacked hotels, residential buildings, and the airport in Dubai. Now, the material damage of these sites is relatively minor. Infrastructure can be repaired. But what's way harder to fix is the psychological effect these attacks have on the lifeblood of the country, wealthy foreigners and investors. Over the past 2 decades, the United Arab Emirates have worked extremely hard to overcome its dependence on oil by transforming into a global financial hub where wealthy individuals and corporations across the globe are eager to invest in. And an important part of this new image is safety, because people will only invest and live in a place where they believe to be secure. But now that illusion has been shattered. Foreigners are leaving the UAE in droves, and no amount of "Oué tu papa" TikTok edits will change that. The situation is similarly difficult for the other Arab Gulf countries, which therefore have a strong interest in seeing this war end as soon as possible. And so Iran's bet is that they will lobby the US to achieve just that. And they do have influence in Trump's administration, since these countries invest enormous sums into the US economy and help maintain American dominance across the Middle East. When we look at both of these measures Iran is pursuing in this war, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the wide-scale attacks on neighboring countries, we can see that they work in different ways towards the same goal, crippling the regional and global economy, which puts pressure on the US to end the war before it and Israel can achieve their objectives. And this strategy might end up working because there are several additional factors that make it important for the US to keep this war as short as possible. Firstly, interventions in the Middle East have become very unpopular in the US, and that is a big problem because the midterm elections will be held in November 2026. If the war drags on, it would make a Democrat takeover of the US House more likely, which would make governing the country for the Trump administration much more difficult. Secondly, US weapons and defense systems used in this war are extremely expensive. The US currently relies on interceptors like the Patriot system, which cost millions of dollars per missile fired, while Iran relies on low-cost ballistic missiles and cheap mass-produced drones. And on top of that, these US systems are replenished only slowly. If the war drags on long enough, the US, Israel and the Arab Gulf states may run dangerously low on interceptors. Now, these countries are working on cheaper interceptor alternatives by developing their own low-cost interceptor drone concepts. However, it's unclear whether they can make the shift fast enough. In addition, the US has already lost several fighter jets with an estimated combined cost of roughly $300 million, not to mention the material damage to US assets across the bases in the region. In total, some analysts estimate that the entire war could end up costing the US between 40 and 100 billion US dollars. So, when looking at the situation, Iran should be able to keep this strategy going long enough to force the US and Israel to end the conflict, right? Well, maybe not. Because while Iran's strategy seems genius in the short term, there is a huge problem with it in the long term. It is destroying Iran's geostrategic position in the region. Remember when I said that Iran's neighbors wanted to avoid a war because they knew it would wreak havoc on their economies? Well, that clearly failed, and the war has proven to the world just how vulnerable these economies are to a regional conflict. So let's say Iran succeeds and there is another ceasefire agreement with the US and Israel. That does not resolve the conflict at all. Instead, it just postpones another inevitable confrontation for maybe a few months, years, who knows really. And that means we'd have to go through this nightmare again, which begs the question, how do they make sure that the next war won't hurt them again so much? One answer might be ensuring that the next conflict is quick and decisive. So they will likely massively increase their military capabilities and efforts to contain or weaken Iran's regional power by curtailing its links to their regional proxies in Iraq, Lebanon and Yemen. And should the conflict reignite once again in the future, Iran's neighbors might even take an active role in ensuring that Iran is defeated before it can ruin their economies once more. Because of these long-term downsides, it seems that at least segments of the Iranian leadership are reconsidering the scale of their approach. On March 7th, the president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, publicly apologized to Iran's neighbors and announced that Iran would halt attacks unless Iran is attacked from the territory within those neighboring states. That being said, Iranian attacks have continued even after the announcement. And in regards to blocking the Strait of Hormuz, Iran might soften its approach as well. Recently, it announced that it may consider allowing limited energy exports from the Persian Gulf as long as the oil is paid for in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars, which alleviates pressure from global energy markets but also undermines the US dollar as a global reserve currency. Both of these developments show us that Iran is being put before a difficult choice. They can either maximize the chances of surviving this war by using every advantage they have at the expense of its relationships with its neighbors and the world, or Iran can scale back its attacks in hopes that it can salvage its relationships at the cost of giving the US and Israel more breathing room in this conflict. But salvaging those relationships would require Iran to give guarantees that it won't launch widespread attacks on non-military targets in the future, which would cause Iran's future deterrence to suffer. However Iran on the one side and the US and Israel on the other decide to proceed in this war, one thing is clear: once the dust settles, the map of the Middle East might seem the same as before, but the underlying dynamic of the region will have changed forever. If you're wondering how the US and Israel may seek to utilize separatist aspirations in Iran, check out this video I made on this exact topic. Thanks for watching, and thanks to my patrons and channel members. I'll see you in the next one.